Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Friday, June the 13th, 2025. I'm going to start off by telling you what I'm not going to be talking about in this video, and I'm not going to be talking about the plane crash which just happened in India. That's because firstly, I prepared something else, and secondly, it's just happened and I wanted to, read a bit more about exactly what happened and get the precise time of when the accident happened. I mean, I know what we have the time of the takeoff, but right now I don't know exactly when it went down. Was it exactly at the time of takeoff? I don't think it was. But anyway, I will be looking at the plane crash that took place in India, in Ahmedabad, in my next video. What I want to look at in this video is a square between Jupiter and Saturn, which takes place over the weekend. And I regard this square aspect as being extremely important. And you could say it's the most important aspect, of the year, especially as it takes place in cardinal signs. And I'll be looking at what it means for the world and for particular countries. But before I consider the Jupiter square Saturn, which by the way could well have an impact on the business cycle and on the markets, I want to consider the astrology and I Ching for today, which is Friday, June the 13th. So here is the picture for today, set for noon, New York, Friday, June the 13th, and the moon is still in Capricorn, and it's not actually doing very much in Capricorn. We've had a trine to Venus. We've had that. We've got that out of the way. Of course, at the beginning of the sign, when the moon went into Capricorn, it made squares to Saturn and Neptune. But now it's not really going anywhere. And in fact, the moon is void of course. It's void of course because it has made its last major aspect to a traditional planet before leaving the sign. You might say, okay, the moon is making a trine, applying to a trine to Uranus, but Uranus is not a traditional planet. So, I do regard the moon as being void. And there aren't any lunar aspects of note. And in fact, there aren't any real aspects of note at all. The only real aspect that crops up is a decile between Venus and Saturn. Venus and Saturn are 36 degrees apart. It's a 1/10 of a circle. And, as far as what that means is, it could be quite restrained, and it might be in keeping with the fact that the moon is void of course in Capricorn. Moon in Capricorn can be reserved, wants to get its priorities right. And so Venus decile Saturn, it's what we're trying to create, what kind of image we're trying to create. And some of us may be trying to deliberately come over as being quite reserved and detached. And it's not a bad aspect, by the way, Venus decile Saturn. It's an option. It's something we can do. It's something we can tune into if we want to. And if we want to show that we are detached and can be somewhat tough and distanced. I know that sounds a little bit weird, being tough and being distant. Well, tough, perhaps as being emotionally tough and things don't bother us. At least that's the impression we want to give. Are we really feeling like that? Well, not necessarily, but appearances do count for something. And so that's the picture. If we set the chart for New York, if we set the chart for Sydney, Australia, moon is still in Capricorn, and the moon is still void of course. The moon, even though it's very early in the sign, or relatively early in the sign, it's still void. And so that suggests that the picture in Australia and New Zealand, it's going to be pretty similar to what it's like in the Americas. Okay, the moon is closer to the trine to Venus. I mean, it's still a separating trine to Venus, so there might be more flow in Australia and New Zealand than in the Americas, but I don't think there's really is, a great deal of difference there. And turning to the heliocentric picture, putting the Earth at the center, the Sun at the center of the solar system, that T-square, Mars opposition Neptune with Jupiter on the T, still very much in evidence. Mars is getting close to that square to Jupiter. So Mars square Jupiter, it is a time when we might want to be getting things done, and we might feel that we have to somehow apply ourselves, do something to be assertive and make an impression. And are we going to be successful? Well, not necessarily, although there are going to be actors out there that are trying their hardest to make some kind of impact, although it could potentially be hard work. Now, going back to the geocentric picture, I was actually just looking at what was exact over the course of Friday. Now, there are some aspects which are not exact, which we still need to take into consideration. And those aspects would be, for example, Mars square Uranus. Mars is less than a degree away from the square of Uranus today, and now that Mars square Uranus is going to be exact over the weekend. We also have Jupiter applying to a square of Saturn, and that aspect is more collective. And I'm not convinced that we're necessarily going to feel that Jupiter square Saturn directly, immediately, although it is in cardinal signs. And so this Jupiter Saturn square, I mean, I'll be talking a lot more about the Jupiter Saturn square later in the video, but you have Jupiter in Cancer square Saturn in Aries, and that is a fascinating square, because you have got Jupiter in its exaltation square Saturn in its fall. And you might say, well, poor Jupiter applying to Saturn. On the other hand, you could also say that Jupiter is stronger than Saturn. But there is a tension here between Jupiter, we want expansion, we want to move forward, we want to be positive, but Saturn is holding us back, and Saturn is being negative. And of course, this Jupiter-Saturn square has a lot to do with the business cycle. Jupiter is about growth, Saturn is about contraction. And then we've got this Mars-Uranus square. With the plane crash in India, we're probably starting to feel its impact, and it's quite a dangerous aspect. This Mars-Uranus square, Mars-Uranus as a pair, is about things going wrong, accidents, mishaps. Of course, in the case of the plane crash in India, it's about a lot of people dying. And it's not exact. So over the weekend, it will be exact. We might feel it's full force, but even today, Friday, bear in mind Mars is square Uranus, and the best we can do is just take it easy and not to be in too much of a rush, and not to take risks, and don't do dangerous stuff. Don't play with heavy equipment and things you don't understand, because things could go wrong. And it's not really a time for leaving things to chance. Especially if it is a sort of personal safety issue. So let me now look at things from the perspective of the 12 signs. So, as I've just said, there's only one real aspect of importance becoming exact today, and that is the Venus decal Saturn. I mean, there are other things going on. We have to consider what the moon is doing, and of course we've got Mars applying to a square of Uranus, so it's not like there's nothing going on. But there isn't so much immediately to talk about when I'm going through the 12 signs. So bear that in mind. Anyway, these are my forecasts for 12 signs for today, which is Friday, June the 13th, 2025. Aries. Aries, yes, you know that there are things that need to be accomplished. At least that's what you believe. And you might, want to put a lot of work into, finishing things off. It is Friday, end of a working week for many of us, and you try your hardest, but you shouldn't expect too much, because it's quite likely that the main action has actually already happened. You've done what you can, you've had some successes, and if you really feel that you can push things further, well, Aries, it's possible that you might be mistaken. So maybe it's a day for just wrapping things up, not feeling that you have to initiate anything new. And additionally, Aries, you may find that you are distracted by just things happening which may not be relevant to you, at least not directly relevant to you. So you may be concerned about the whole tragedy of the thing. When I say the thing, everything. Just there is something tragic going on, and it affects everyone, and you don't have to be bothered by it if you don't want to be, but Aries, you might be, and you might feel that you should really take on board other people's suffering, and that suffering is everywhere, and you just have to turn on the TV, look at the internet. It's there, and you could say, well, there's no point in being sort of too caught up in it, and you don't want to get too angry about it. There's always something to get angry about, but just anger for the sake of anger, for sort of venting steam, it's probably a waste of time. So, perhaps Aries, you need to just accept that situation and not try to do anything too dramatic. We do have a square aspect between Mars and Uranus, and that Mars square Uranus does potentially make you feel tense, as if you have to do something, you want to do something. But if you just do something, especially if it's spur of a moment, it might not work. You might not actually know what you're doing, and there could well be a sense of delusion, and that could cause problems. And if we look at the heliocentric picture, there is a square aspect between Mars and Jupiter, and Mars is also opposition Neptune. And you could say that's quite dynamic, Mars square Jupiter heliocentrically, but it could just be, at best, much ado about nothing. At worst, it could be you feeling you have to get involved, you do get involved, but again, do you actually know what you're doing? And quite possibly you don't know what you're doing, because Mars is making an opposition to Neptune. And so, Aries, it might well be the case that you should just try not to get involved. Whatever it is, just don't get involved, and don't take things personally. There are a lot of impersonal actions going on. There are things going on that you can't do anything about, and you could say it's not even your business, but you might want to make it your business, and I don't necessarily think that that's a good idea. So, overall, Aries, if you want to have a useful day, it really should be about tying things up and wrapping things up, and not, taking on, anything new. And remember, we've just had a full moon, and the full moon, ideally, you should have started to understand the truth of the matter. And if you act, too quickly without thinking, well, you might just be doing stuff that you maybe should have got over from the past, but you want to keep on doing it, and yet that might not be such a good thing. Taurus. Taurus, it's a day which is quietly quite friendly and sociable. I mean, I think that you can be a social actor, and you can really make an impression, and people will notice you. And one reason they might notice you is because today there isn't a great deal going on, and because not a great deal is going on, then maybe it's just easy to get noticed if you make an effort. And so, if you are prepared to sort of mix with people, and you try to be warm and friendly, that should work. And of course, you're helped by the fact that Venus is in Taurus, and maybe you're still getting used to Venus being in Taurus, but Venus in Taurus, that is that is a great sign placement for Venus. So do make the most of it. And also, Taurus, you can explore without having to commit. So there might be things that you want to know about, and you're not sure. It might be a good idea. It might not be a good idea. It's like you want to browse, and it's like you want to browse without being disturbed. You don't want, if you're in a shop, you want to be able to browse without some shop assistant asking you what you're looking for. Can they help? You just want to. That's what you want to do. You want to explore one thing, and you want to explore another thing, and it may work, it might not work, but at the moment, it's not a time for moving in any particular direction. Just be happy where you are, and do enjoy other people's company, but in a gentle way, and don't take any one person too seriously. And probably a good idea not to get overly involved with any one particular person. There is a square aspect between Mars and Uranus at the moment, and that Mars-Uranus square is quite tense. It could be dangerous, and it might say something about another person's behavior. I mean, you're probably fairly laid back, but not everyone else is. Some people just might be tense and annoyed, and they want things to happen, and but nothing is happening, but they still want to create something out of nothing, and they might want to create a drama out of nothing. And so you have to treat such people with a degree of caution, and don't listen too hard to another person's suggestions. They could lead you in an area and lead you down vistas that could be dangerous. It's certainly not a good time for taking initiatives, and people with dangerous ideas should be avoided, or at least you shouldn't be following them. So that might even apply to people well. I mean, you might think that they can be trusted. I mean, part of you actually wants to follow. I mean, if someone is exciting, yeah, sure, you want to follow their lead. But I don't really think, at the moment that is an especially good idea. So basically, Taurus, it shouldn't be an exciting day. It can be a quietly sociable day, but don't feel that you really have to initiate anything. Gemini, it's another day, moon in Capricorn. Capricorn is not a sign that Geminis always feel comfortable with. It's, Capricorn and Gemini, these two signs that are so different from one another. And, while the moon is in Capricorn, you're maybe being, forced to see things in a new way, perhaps in a different way. And that might, encourage you to, take a more in-depth approach. Again, it's not something you necessarily want to do, but it might be the right thing to do. And I don't think that you really want to do anything dramatic. Although you can be dramatic if you want to be dramatic. Some people are just not moving. They're not doing anything. They appear to be fairly stuck. And if you want, Gemini, you can create an impression. And the question is, what's the follow-up going to be? So yes, there's no doubt that you can do something dramatic. You can put yourself in a situation where everyone is looking at you, and then what happens afterwards? And being able to see through any initiatives you take could be hard work. And that is because the moon is void of course. The moon has made its last major aspect to a traditional planet before leaving the sign. So it could seem dramatic. Okay, the moon is making a trine to Uranus, but Uranus is not a traditional planet, and Uranus, might be spectacular, but that moon trine Uranus in the end, or that moon trine Uranus isn't really until tomorrow, but it's not leading anywhere, I don't think. So, that does mean, Gemini, that perhaps you should, trim your expectations and just, concentrate on sorting things out, working out what matters to you, a time for thinking, a time for feeling, and for really trying to understand what's important to you. And I don't think you have to worry too much about what other people are doing. Cancer, the moon continues moving through Capricorn. The moon is, sure, it's in your opposite sign, and you might think that moon moving through your opposite sign, that says something about relationships. And it's true that other people's actions can appear to have an impact on you. Other people might get noticed, and you might be thinking, okay, you've been noticed, you have to do something, you have to make an impression, you have to go through the motions of listening to what another person is saying, or watching what they're doing. But don't take it too seriously. And the moon is void of course, and with the moon being void of course, what that means is that the moon has made its last major aspect before leaving the sign. And so that is because the key planets that the moon could be making an aspect to are very early in the signs. We've got Saturn is in Aries, so that moon square Saturn was a long time ago. Mercury, Jupiter in early Cancer, so those oppositions were in the past. And the only traditional planet in late signs, in late degrees, is Mars at 27, 28 Leo. But the moon is making a quincunx to Mars, and that's not until tomorrow, and secondly, it's not a major aspect, so the moon is void. And so there seems to be the potential for things to be going on. People seem to be offering you things. There seem to be opportunities, but really it may not be going anywhere. And if you know that things are going nowhere, then that might put you at an advantage. And sometimes it's actually good that things are going nowhere. It's a neutral statement. It's not meant to be a bad statement. It means that things aren't moving towards a difficult situation. You're not moving towards some explosion. And so it might actually be quite a good day for just not getting noticed. Even though it seems you're being noticed, it seems that people are watching you, it seems that people are important, but in reality, no. Today just could be a bit of a nothing, and that might actually give you a certain amount of freedom to quietly do what's important to you. Though, again, don't expect anything, because it's really not that kind of day. And really, Cancer, it might be as simple as that. Now, if we are really, really dredging for aspects, and you're looking at some aspects, something to say, then, okay, the moon is making a sextile to true black moon Lilith. And it's a sextile. And that might mean that some Cancerians may be able to, enjoy things which are sort of rather dark and even sinister, at least on the surface. But maybe where there are dark feelings, there are opportunities. And just because there are dark feelings around, Lilith, after all, is a being of the night, and she's interesting, and she's got things to offer, and so you might want to sort of, on a psychological level, explore Lilith's offers. What is she saying? And she's perhaps also a being from the past who represents sort of things that people don't often want to touch, and with that sextile you might be able to really interact very effectively with the Lilith energy, though don't expect immediate dramatic results. And it could actually be quite creative. Where there is unpleasantness, there is a possibility of creativity. If everything is nice and above board and everyone is smiling, well, can you really have real creativity? I think there is very often a darkness to creativity, which maybe some Cancerians are able to tune into. Leo, if you've been listening to what I've been saying for some of the signs, I've been a bit downbeat. And that's because I'm not convinced that a great deal is going on. And as far as you're concerned, you might have ideas and you might want to talk about stuff, but it could be frustrating. You might feel that you're trying to make progress, and it just could be that the words just don't come out. And if the words do come out, they're just not as impressive as you thought they were going to be. And that can often happen. I mean, it can happen with my YouTube videos. I mean, my YouTube videos, I have no way of knowing how well a video is going to do. But one thing I have noticed, if I do a video and I'm really, really pleased with it, I'm really happy about it, and I thought that was a good video and I made some really interesting points, that kind of video often just doesn't work out, and I make these points that I think of a key point about the video, and a key point about some astrological concept, and I think I've been clever, and I look at the comments and it just seems no one's noticed, and the video doesn't do very well. So that seems to be a trend with YouTube videos. So it could be that you think that things should be working out and they don't, and yeah, you thought you had something really interesting to say, but for some reason you can't get the words together. So don't feel that you have to do anything, that you have to communicate anything. And, in fact, if you've got something really important to say today, and you feel that it's really important, and you want people to listen, and you think you've done a good job, maybe you should postpone it, because I don't think that people will necessarily get what you're trying to say, and that might indeed be the right approach. Now, one thing going on, one aspect that we should perhaps consider, is an aspect between the Sun and the nodal axis. So, the North Node is around sort of 2236 Pisces, Sun is at 2253 Gemini. So, with Sun square the nodal axis, do think about what you are doing and ask yourself, are you doing the right thing? And I'm talking about your priorities. And some of your priorities may still need to be worked through. And it could be that you have oversimplified something. And that might relate to money, actually. Because, the North Node is in Pisces, the South Node is in Virgo. Pisces, Virgo in the Leo chart, represents the financial axis. And the nodal axis is encouraging you to take money seriously and to see, below the surface, and not to just assume everything's fine. You might not want to think about money, but maybe you should. And it's not just about looking at a bank statement. You have to go further than that. You have to look at all of the the financial connections that you're involved with, and particularly those connections relating to other people. And with the Sun making the square to the nodal axis, it seems that you want things to be simple. You want to be able to talk about one thing, talk about another thing. You don't want to stay on one topic, a serious topic, and it may not just be a financial topic. Some topic of interest, and not just interest, importance, but something about you wants to just move on and not dwell on it. But perhaps you should dwell on it. And that may be how the Sun nodal axis is working. An alternative view of it is that you're not taking the time to understand what certain people are really like. And there may be a tendency to trivialize a particular social interaction. You just look at the general flow, and you don't actually think about what's actually going on underneath. And maybe you should be trying to work out what's going on underneath. So if you're talking to people, particularly if you have to deal with people, quite intensively, then really try to understand what it's all about and what motivates them. I don't think it's something you want to do. I don't think, in a way, at the moment, you want to be a psychologist, but a psychological approach actually may be called for at the moment, and you have to ask questions, about other people's motivations right now. With the Sun aspecting the nodal axis, and don't forget, Pluto is now in Aquarius. Okay, it's been in Aquarius for months, but since November of last year. But perhaps you're still getting used to it. And Pluto in Aquarius is asking you to take relationships seriously and not to just take things at face value. Virgo, I think today you can largely do what you like, and there shouldn't really be any pressure. And ideally, Virgo, you'll just think about perhaps an activity that you enjoy, that's important to you, that's worked out in the past, and you just continue with it. And it should, work out fine. And it's not like you're going to feel that, anything super dramatic is going to happen, but you can just have a sort of a quiet sense of, quiet satisfaction that you are going in the right direction. And, you don't have to tell other people what you're doing if you don't want to. You can do things quietly. But if you want to make an impression, I think you can. It is a day when most people are probably going to be fairly low energy. And you, Virgo, you might actually have more energy than maybe 80-90% of the rest of the population. So maybe you should take advantage of that. And you can maybe do something that people just weren't expecting, and you do it, and they're surprised. They're surprised you make the effort. They're surprised you care. And because you do that, you can gain some kind of advantage and also move things on. Some people do need to be moved on. They're just a bit stuck. And maybe you're exactly the person to do it. And additionally, there is a trine today between the moon and the south node, or indeed there's a sextile between the moon and the north node, and a trine between the moon and the south node. And so that says something about what you're doing, how you are being creative, and whether you're doing things in the right way. Now, it is a day when you can be self-contained, but it's possible that you have to perhaps really struggle to understand what other people want in a situation where they're not giving any cues. Other people aren't bothered. They don't appear to be bothered, but maybe you should be bothered, and maybe you should really try to force someone to give you an opinion or to give you feedback. So perhaps you're doing something and you're not sure whether it's right or wrong, and no one's interfering and no one's commenting, but maybe you should demand that you get some feedback, that you get some comments, and you perhaps have to just force people to show an interest. Yeah, and that's hard, because I think today is, in many respects, is quite a disinterested day. But it's, at some stage, you should make the effort, and you can make the effort. You can force people to look at what you're doing and look at who you are and give you a response. And I think at some level you need a response. Libra, this is a time when there is a lot going on. I mean, it is very active. We've just had a full moon. Mars is square Uranus over the weekend. Over the weekend, Jupiter square Saturn. Later in this video, I'll be talking in detail about this square between Jupiter and Saturn. And of course, you've got Venus is now in Taurus, which is in its own sign. Yeah, that's good. But as far as today is concerned, it might be just a resting place, somewhere where you just sort of pull over, and because you just need a break. And that means that you don't necessarily have to do anything. And if you just want to enjoy your own company or enjoy the company of family and close friends, you can. And I just don't think there's any problem there. And things are going to sort of become more active later on, but perhaps over the weekend. But right now things do feel relatively quiet, and The only thing to say is that Mars is making a square to Uranus, but that Mars square Uranus is exact over the weekend, and you may not feel that Mars square Uranus. And I don't think you're going to feel that Mars square Uranus if you do stick to your own company. That Mars square Uranus is about another person. In most cases, I think about another person who has their own way of doing things, a person who could be quite willful, and they could actually be quite dangerous as well. And people who have definite ideas, who are willful, who insist on getting their way, should perhaps be, the kinds of people who should be avoided. They could cause trouble, but there is an optionality to that. You don't have to deal with such people if you don't want to, and if you want to do absolutely nothing, then that is an option. And you could say that the more time you spend at home or in somewhere where you feel safe and secure, the better. And so Libra, just stay out of trouble and quietly do what is important to you, and that's probably the right approach. Now, as far as relationships are concerned, if you do have to deal with other people, then you might want to adopt a particular style. And if you want to be at the moment, you can actually come over as being quite aloof and detached. And you can do it in a way that is somewhat contrived. So if you want to give the impression that you are emotionally tough and that you don't care and that you are distant and you are detached, but you're emotionally cold, then you can. Now, being emotionally cold might not sound like a good idea, and you're not emotionally cold, but for one reason or another today, there may be an advantage in coming over as being emotionally cold. Okay, that's perhaps an exaggeration. Maybe I meant to say emotionally distant, but it's the right style. It's the right style for you at the moment, because emotional involvement isn't going to get you anywhere. And the more detached you can be, the better. And detachment is not going to be automatic, but if you make the effort, I think you can give the impression of being distant from everything, and I think that people will respect that. Scorpio, I should say that Mars is actually getting quite close to changing sign. So you've got used to Mars being in Leo, and you've had Mars in Leo on and off since the autumn of last year. I think it was around the time of the presidential election that Mars went into Leo. And okay, it went back into Cancer, but it's still there. It just shows that when Mars goes retrograde, it can stay in a sign on and off for a long time. But now Mars is now at 27:57 Leo at noon, getting ready to move into Virgo, and it's actually starting to get quite close to Regulus, the royal star. And so Regulus, the royal star, is at around 0 degrees Virgo, and it's not just a single moment when Mars is on Regulus. We can allow some orb, and so you could say that for a week or two Mars will have that Regulus energy, and so it's important that you really do try to take advantage of that Regulus energy. And it's not just about today. And let me just look at when exactly Mars is changing signs. So Mars moves into Virgo. I make it around the 7th. So okay, that will be the sort of beginning of next week, but you need to get ready for that. And Mars on Regulus, perhaps you can take advantage of it in your work, for example, or whatever you're trying to do. you can come over in a grand way. Regulus is the royal star, and there could be something about you now that can be larger than life. And additionally, if you're trying to get in contact with important people, then now might be the time to do it. Now, when I say important people, it's all relative, isn't it? I mean, it might be that an important person is, if you're working, someone in a senior position in your company, for example, or it could be an important contact. Okay, it could be the king, whoever the king might be, could represent politicians and monarchs and that kind of contact. But whatever important contact you need to get your way is something you should think about. You don't necessarily have to do everything, on your own, but you yourself have something about you that is rather grand and is rather imperious. And I don't actually mean that in a negative way. I think that you actually can come over as being an important person, as really someone who's got something to offer and who's got something special. And so, Scorpio, it's important that you don't be too modest with Mars conjunct Regulus. Okay, you could go the other way, and you could be totally obnoxious and really push things as hard as you can and demand attention. Well, in that case, Regulus can crash and burn. I mean, that is an aspect of Regulus. If you do take things too far, you can have sudden falls from grace. That could be a possibility, but you'd have to be very arrogant and obnoxious about that. And you're not that kind of person, are you? If you were that kind of person, you wouldn't be watching that video. So yeah, don't forget Regulus. And also at the moment, Scorpio, it does seem that many Scorpios do feel that they've got something they have to say. They feel that they've got something to offer verbally, though don't expect everyone to listen. Now, there are things that are important to you, and you want them to be important to other people as well. And at the moment, many Scorpios are just thinking about the world and what's going on in the world, and they're thinking that there are groups of people out there who are suffering. That really hurts. It's because Scorpios have that universal feeling to them. Scorpio is a very compassionate sign, and something going on the other side of the world could really affect you, and you want other people to be affected by it as well. And you might then be concerned by other people's indifference. You're passionate about something, but no one else is, and that might annoy you. But should it annoy you? I don't think so. Not really. It's just the way the world is. And so, Scorpio, you can do what you have to do, and I think that I do think it's a time when you can be successful. And I'm not just talking about today, but it's over the next few days. Make the most of Mars being in that high-profile sign of Leo. While it's there, and just as it moves into Virgo, it does make that conjunction to Regulus, and I think that really could help you. So if you've got ambitions, immediate ambitions, don't give up on them. It's not too late, and over the next few days, you do have a chance to really sort them out. Even though it is the weekend, or at least the weekend is coming up. Sagittarius, you may feel that there are a few financial matters that you want to sort out. I mean, why not? The moon's in Capricorn, and it's always good to have an appreciation of the financial dimension, but at the same time, you shouldn't be expecting huge results. I mean, the moon may be in Capricorn, but it's void of course in Capricorn. In other words, the moon has made its last major aspect to a traditional planet before leaving the sign, and because of that, things might be going nowhere. So it could be, for example, that there's something you're trying to sort out of a financial nature, and you're trying very hard, and it's a Friday, end of a week, but you might not be able to make the key connections, and so by the end of the day you might just feel you've run out of time and things are closing, and that could be quite frustrating. So perhaps, Sagittarius, you shouldn't expect too much, and you should avoid taking on anything new, because if you do, you might be disappointed. Though, Sagittarius, you do have a lot to say, a surprising amount to say, at first you might be asking yourself, what is the point? Are the words going to come out? But actually, they are coming out. Mercury is still making a conjunction to Jupiter. It might seem a long way off. Jupiter is at 9 degrees Cancer. Sorry, Mercury is at 9 degrees Cancer. Jupiter's at 0 degrees Cancer. So Mercury is well away from a conjunction of Jupiter. But then, if you look at the chart overall, you can see that Jupiter is 9 degrees away from the Sun, because the Sun is at 23 Sagittarius, Gemini, so it's approximately 8-9 degrees away from the Sun. And Jupiter is also 9 degrees away from Mercury, so of course that means that Jupiter is conjunct the Sun-Mercury midpoint. And so with Jupiter conjunct the Sun-Mercury midpoint, there's a lot for you to say. And the key thing is to say things of value. Because if you say things which are fairly sort of on the surface, they may relate to things which are pretty trivial. It's not going to make a difference. People aren't going to listen. Your attempts at small talk, might fail. On the other hand, if you can address things that, which are really quite deep and profound, and you can get people to listen, then I think that you will make an impression, and it could require some effort. It could also require you to really bring to bear the way you feel about a particular subject. But I think the people who matter will pay attention to you. So just because it seems to be difficult to make an impact doesn't mean it's impossible. But if you're going to make an impression, you have to be very serious about it. It's not a time for it's not a time for being trivial. If you can't say anything useful, if you can't say anything of any great depth, well, probably best not to bother. So that's pretty much what the day is like. I don't think that it's going to be, for most Sagittarians, an especially dramatic day, though heliocentrically Mars is making a square to Jupiter. And now that heliocentric Mars square Jupiter, remember, Mars is making an opposition to Neptune, and Jupiter's making square to Neptune. So there is this heliocentric T-square, and so Mars making a square to Jupiter, there may be things encouraging you to really push things out, and you may not be in full control of it, because we're dealing with heliocentric aspects. When you're talking about the heliocentric chart, you're talking about high level forces, which are fairly cosmic. Just a reminder of the heliocentric chart. There is there's Jupiter, your ruler. There's Mars making that square to making the square to Jupiter. So that Mars square Jupiter may put you in touch with some force. It could be a force within yourself, but it could be sort of triggered by by the universe, and you just feel that you have to do something. And additionally, by the way, Jupiter is making a heliocentric quincunx to Pluto, and again, that's a tough energy. And so the question is, do you want to get involved with these energies? You don't have to. It can just be a totally quiet day if that's what you want. But if you think about it, there are things that need to be done, things that need to be addressed, and they're not trivial. And if you can focus on them and give it everything, then I think that you will be heard. But you've got to be really involved in things 100%. It's not a time to be half-hearted. If you want to be half-hearted, if you're not able to be committed, then just forget it. Just have a quiet day and things should be fine. Capricorn, the moon is still in your sign, and with the moon in your sign, you're feeling still pretty good about yourself. There's nothing especially dramatic happening. It could actually be a quiet day because the moon, it might be moving through Capricorn, but your sign, but it's void. It's made its last major aspect before leaving the sign, and so with the moon being void, you're feeling good, but you also know that not much can be done. And if you've done things in the recent past, that's great. But if you're trying to do things in the immediate future, well, might be you've missed your chance. Or being a Capricorn, you don't miss your chance. Hopefully you get in there early, you did what you had to do, and now it's just a question of waiting and just seeing how things pan out. And I don't think, Capricorn, there is much in the way of obligation, and that should mean that your approach can be fairly relaxed. I don't think you're going to be very pushy. You're going to be quite easygoing, and people will enjoy your company. But again, I don't see anything dramatic going on, and it does seem that some people do find you appealing and they want to get close to you, and that's good. But again, not much happens, and this might say something about relationships. From a relationship angle, you're an easy person to deal with, and relationships should go quite well. But again, nothing dramatic, and that could be a good thing. Why would you want drama? And if you just allow things to sort of pan out in their own quiet way, then there's really nothing to complain about. And really, Capricorn, that is probably all there is to say. Although there is a decile between Venus and Saturn. So Venus and Saturn are 36 degrees apart, and Saturn is your ruler. And so with this Venus decile Saturn, it may say something about what you can create, the kind of impression you can create. And Venus is the planet of relationships. And if you want to get on with people and to take things further, I've already said that I don't think that much is going to be happening today, and including in terms of relationships. It's going to be probably a relatively boring day, and you should be happy, but it's going to be a relatively boring day. But if you want to make a special effort, if you're one of those Capricorns who feels that it is necessary, that you absolutely need to make an impact on another person, you think it's important, then with that Venus decile Saturn, you can. It's not necessarily going to be easy because, today there's not much going on. There's not much energy around today. And so you would have to make a special effort. You'd have to really try. But again, if it's important and you really, really make an effort, then I think that you can actually get people's attention, and there can be something about you that stands out. If that is that is important to you. And additionally, with this Venus decal Saturn, it could actually be quite helpful if you're working today, and your impression of work, having to deal with employers, employees, again, if that's appropriate, or clients, or whatever your working situation is, assuming you have a working situation, but or if you're looking for a job, if you really make a special effort, then you can get over what is on the surface quite a tedious situation, and you can turn things round, and you can get over the fact that the moon is void, of course, and you can get everyone's attention. And once you get everyone's attention, you have a chance to really assert yourself, not as in power, trying to be powerful, but just making an impression and actually turning things round so that things start to move in the way that you actually want them to move. But it's another situation where you would have to expend a lot of effort. You'd have to really think about it. I mean, you can do it, but you just might take the view that it's just not worth your while. Aquarius today is undramatic for many of us. So you shouldn't necessarily expect a great deal to be going on. And that shouldn't bother you. You can't have every day being super active. And sometimes it's just best to do nothing, and maybe that might be the best way of dealing with today, with Friday. And you can see things that you would maybe like to be doing, but are you really going to have the opportunity? And there's a possibility that if you try too hard to create something, then it's just going to be a waste of time. Though it might depend on your approach and how urgent it feels. What if you really, really want something to happen, and in that case, okay, you can create an impression, and you could create quite a good impression if you really wanted to. But it does mean that you have to put a lot of effort into it. A really serious amount of effort. And, so, do think about where you want to put your energy. Or you may want to put your energy into nothing, in which case, that's okay. Now, perhaps the focus of your efforts should be, your own home, where you spend most of your time, where you feel comfortable. And so if you feel that you're not comfortable enough, or that you need more security or more support, then you can actually make it happen. It's through a real sort of effort of will, and you can actually create something out of nothing. It will be hard work, though. It's absolutely not going to be easy. Not least because the moon is void, of course. The moon is, it's made its last major aspect before leaving the sign, so it's like applying to nothing. Okay, the moon is applying to a trine of Uranus, but Uranus is not a traditional planet, and so Aquarius, decide if anything is important, decide if anything is important enough for you to make an effort. Now, talking about Uranus, there is a square between Mars and Uranus, and that square takes place over the weekend, but it's still pretty close right now. I mean, Mars is at 28 Leo, Uranus is at 28 Taurus, getting really close, and that Mars square Uranus could be about aggravation. And the question is, where would that aggravation come from? I think that aggravation could come from another person. Mars is in Leo. Mars is in Leo, your opposite sign. It's square Uranus, and that may describe another person's behavior. Another person could be creating trouble, could be creating waves where it's just not needed, not required, and that's not what you're interested in. And so, don't be too sociable today unless you really thought it through, because some people could be more trouble than they're worth. And if in doubt, just stick to your own company. There's no need to take risks, and it can actually be just a quiet day where not a great deal happens. And at the same time, if you've got people around you who you like, and you really trust, and they don't have a track record of causing problems, then things should be okay. And you should be looking for comfort. Comfort is what matters. Just feeling comfortable where you are, and just not feeling that you really have to do anything. And also, don't spend too much time listening to other people. You can have people around you, but in terms of what they're actually saying, then it may not be very inspiring. In fact, some people might use words to justify inertia. So people say stuff and it's not encouraging. It might seem rather negative, and it's probably best if some people don't say anything. And that could just sum up the day. You cannot have an active day every day. Though another aspect that I will be talking about later in this video is a square between Jupiter and Saturn, and that Jupiter-Saturn square is actually exact over the weekend. But Saturn is your ruler, Jupiter is square Saturn, and so you do have to think, what might that aspect represent. And it's about starting to understand what Jupiter in Cancer really means to you, because Jupiter has changed sign, and it's no longer in Gemini, it's in Cancer. And Jupiter in Cancer, it could be about the actions you need to take to make yourself feel better. And you may be stuck in your way, you may be stuck in your ways, you may be stuck in a particular routine, stuck in a particular lifestyle, and Jupiter is suggesting to you that this might not be such a good idea, that you might need to make changes for your own good, for your own well-being. But I'll try to talk about that in more detail when I do your reading for the weekend. Pisces, there's a Jupiter-Saturn square coming up over the weekend. And of course, Jupiter is your ruler. So I do think that this Jupiter-Saturn square could have an influence on you. And it's a square that on the surface of it seems quite impersonal, because you are dealing with, outer planets. But then the ruler of Pisces is Jupiter, and Jupiter is... It's not an outer planet like Pluto, but it is quite a long way out. And this Jupiter-Saturn square is quite a slow energy, and it takes time to become exact. I mean, it's already pretty much exact now, but it comes super exact over the weekend. And so with this aspect, you might want to think about some of the things holding you back, because you've got so much to offer with Jupiter moving into Cancer. Jupiter moving into Cancer is really great. I mean, that is it's a fantastic thing to happen. Jupiter, your ruler, being in its exaltation, but then it runs into Saturn, and there is some possibility that you could make money more significant than it actually is. We are ruled by money, and it's money that gives us permission. It's without money, there are things we can't do. At least that's how it feels. And some Pisceans, they have all these ideas. You have these ideas. There are things you want to do. You've got your plans, but you may be coming across a financial block, and it could be in your head. But it's certainly a very good reason not to do something. And over the next few days, over the weekend, you might feel that it's just a great tragedy that you can't do what you want to do because you don't have the resources. And the challenge here is to get over that way of thinking. If something is important to you, and it really does matter, and you've worked it through, and it's a fundamental part of what makes you a unique individual, then you need to be able to do it. And if you do it properly, and you do it with some care and subtlety, you're not going to need any money. But it's just possible that you've overestimated the financial requirement. And remember, Saturn is in Aries. Saturn is fallen in Aries. So Saturn can create problems which shouldn't have to exist, and they could undermine Jupiter. Having said that, Jupiter is in a stronger position than Saturn. Jupiter is exalted, Saturn is fallen at the moment, and so whatever those issues are, I'm fairly confident that you'll be able to get around them. And on a more immediate level, looking at your social life, with the moon moving in Capricorn, you might feel that there are things going on socially that might interest you. And fair enough, if you, for example, want to go to a party this evening, it's a Friday evening, you can if you want to mix with people. But the moon is void. And because the moon is void, having made the last major aspect before leaving the sign, it's just possible that whatever you try to involve yourself in socially, it just doesn't work out. Because people are not really on very good form. They're not very inspired. There isn't much spark. So Pisces, from a social viewpoint, it's important to have low expectations. And your social abilities are going to be good, better than average, but you can't expect much to happen, and you just might feel that things just are a bit flat, and that's just the way it is. And it's the same for everyone. It's certainly not your problem. So maybe you might want to give your social life a miss today, or at least just not put too much energy into it. And if you take that approach, if you have low expectations, then the day should work out in a satisfactory way in the end. And those are my forecasts for the 12 signs. And I now want to look at things from the viewpoint of the I Ching. So I asked the question, what is Friday going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was hexagram number 13, which is with others. Now, I was just talking to Pisces, and I was suggesting to Pisces that socially Pisces might want to get involved with other people, but I was suggesting that Pisces, shouldn't have much in the way of expectations, because the moon is void, of course, and that moon being void, of course, doesn't just affect Pisces; it affects all of us. The moon has made its last aspect before leaving the sign, and or at least it's made its last major aspect to a traditional planet before leaving the sign. So that does mean that not much is happening today. But we have this hexagram with others. It is quite a sociable hexagram. And a lot of us might feel socially inclined. I mean, it's a Friday. Friday is often a day when people like to socialize. And so, Friday parties, I always sort of notice that when people have parties on Fridays, for some reason, they are more intense and more noisy from parties on Saturday. That's not immediately logical, but maybe there's something about Friday when people really just need some break from the stress of the working week. But this with others doesn't necessarily go very far. We have one moving line, and bottom line moving, and it's the beginning of some kind of social action. We want to be with other people. We make the effort, and we don't have any particular motives. We don't quite know what we want, but we make the effort. But it doesn't seem to go anywhere. Bottom line moving, and it just doesn't really happen. And we just start to interact with people, and we're wondering where it's all goes, where it's all going, and then the bottom line, it switches because it moves. It switches from a unbroken to a broken line. So what it switches to is hexagram number 33, which is retreat. So today, Friday, might be about starting to get involved with things, maybe with other people, but just not feeling that it's really going anywhere and just backing off. And that's okay. And it just may be that we are not strong enough. There've been there's a lot of stuff going on at the moment. Okay, today there's actually not much going on, but we're just having a break, and it's perhaps a time when we need to replenish, build our reserves, and we're not really ready for large-scale activity, particularly of a social nature. And in the end, it's just time to just accept that we've taken things as far as we can, and just retreat, back off, go home, and that is the right approach. And really, that's really very simple. So now I want to look at the square between Jupiter and Saturn, and I regard this aspect as being important. Now, it might not seem important at the time, when it's exact, but we have to look at it from a broader perspective. We have to look at the Jupiter-Saturn square from a perspective of the Jupiter-Saturn cycle, the overall cycle. So let's start by looking at this square. So I've set this for London out of convenience. So at 3:36 p.m. on, that would be on Sunday. Sunday is the 15th. I think I've got that right. So on June the 15th, which is a Sunday, Jupiter is, you can see that Jupiter is at 1 degree 18 Cancer, and Saturn is at 1 degree 18 Aries. And so the square represents a stage on the Jupiter-Saturn cycle. And it all starts with a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. So there was a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, again set for London on December the 21st, 2020. And Jupiter and Saturn are the two great chronocrators, the rulers of time. And so when you've got a Jupiter-Saturn cycle, it's the start of something new. A new era has started. And if we think about previous Jupiter-Saturn cycles, I mean, by the way, I have said some of this stuff before. I may be repeating yourself. If you've been watching my videos for a prolonged period of time, I'm sorry, I may be saying something you've already heard me say several times, but I just want to sort of bring it all together. And so, classic Jupiter-Saturn conjunction would be the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction that took place at the beginning of the 1960s. So sort of around 1960, 61. That was a new beginning, certainly from a Western perspective. It's very easy to look at things, just from the perspective of the West. So, for example, you think of the 60s, swinging 60s, okay, might have been the case in London if you were in Carnaby Street or if you were in San Francisco and Haight-Ashbury, but what if you were, I don't know, in Chad or Mali or somewhere in the developing world? It may not be the same. Or indeed, if you were in Biafra, remember there was a really dreadful civil war in Nigeria that everyone seems to have forgotten about, but that was taking place in the 60s. And so if you think about 1960, 61 from a Western perspective, you think of the 60s, this was a time of people, becoming, it was very progressive. You had restrictions coming to an end. Society was sort of more tolerant, and the 60s developed, and you can think of the Beatles. The Beatles with how they started in the 1960s as being sort of fairly sort of clean-cut, straightforward, and then becoming more complicated as the 1960s developed. And so that would be the way a cycle develops. And you could say that the election of Kennedy was the beginning of the 60s. And then when he was shot, you had Lyndon B. Johnson, and you had all the you had a progressive government. Lyndon B. Johnson represented the expansion of the welfare state, the end of segregation. This is all how the 60s developed. And sort of what happens is when you have the Jupiter-Saturn cycle, you then move towards the opposition, and it's at the time of the opposition where things go wrong. People are excited at the beginning with Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, and by the opposition, things start going wrong. 1969, 1970, Jupiter opposition Saturn. The 60s become dark. You could say that the 60s ended in 1969 with the Manson killings and the killing of Sharon Tate. That's when the 60s really became dark, and things do in the end become dark. The 60s, people had all these hopes about changing society. Then in the late 60s, they feel they can't change society anymore, and they have to resort to other things. So you might, for example, in sort of Italy or Germany, you have to resort to terrorism. The Baader-Meinhof gang, the Red Brigades, whatever, the Brigate Rosso. Because you have to. At least that's some people feel they have to, because there's no other way of changing society. So that's when you get to the opposition. It's like all the hope of the conjunction that starts to become sour at the opposition. And so, that's the 60s. And of course, you could say then that the peak where everything is working, where people can be hopeful, maybe a bit naive, but still hopeful that this is where it's happening. All the potential of the conjunction in 1960 of that conjunction in 1960 is realized at the square. So Jupiter square Saturn in the mid 60s, might be, when everything is nice, everything is working. Of course, 1967, you had the sort of the summer of love in the 1960s. So you see the development, then it moves towards the opposition, and then things get more complicated. And the last half, in the waning part of the Jupiter-Saturn cycle, is when you have to really deal with the consequences of it all. And you can see it in previous cycles. I mean, for example, look at the Jupiter-Saturn cycle that happened in the early 20s. The Roaring 20s. Jupiter square Saturn, it's sort of a mid-1920s when everything is fine, the stock market's going up, people are confident, they're sort of upbeat. But then at the end of the 20s, as you move towards a Jupiter opposition Saturn, then it starts to go wrong. You of course had the Wall Street crash in 1920, was it 1929? And so, that's how you should perhaps conceive of these Jupiter-Saturn cycles. And so we've got this Jupiter-Saturn square at the moment. And so often, historically, the waxing Jupiter-Saturn square, around 5 years after the Jupiter-Saturn square, you can get a time of optimism, and it can be a time when the markets seem to really be coming together. I mean, so 1920, and you think of like 1925, when people started to, or the mid 1920s, when you had the waxing Jupiter-Saturn square, things really get themselves together. Or look at 1980, 1980 or 1981, you had a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, and that was rather different. That was when Reagan was becoming president, and it might have started with a big recession. Or a recession sort of exacerbated by Reagan's economic policies, but by the mid 80s, the Reagan era was in full swing. People were again making money out of the stock market. The markets were on great form. Things were moving, and likewise you could say. We had a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in 2000, 2005, 2006, when we had the Jupiter-Saturn square in the middle of that decade. Again, the stock market was going up, property prices were going up, and it was only towards the Jupiter-Saturn opposition. The Jupiter-Saturn opposition was, I think, around 2010, but the great sort of crisis was 2008. But that was towards the end of that first decade of the Jupiter-Saturn cycles. Now, it doesn't necessarily always work. If you look at the 1907, the 1907 panic. If we look at the 1900s, there was a 1907 panic when the stock market completely crashed in the US, and here's a chart of the 1907 panic. So this was. I'm not quite sure what it was about. It doesn't matter, but it was a very difficult time to the stock market, and Jesse Livermore, in his memoirs of a stock operator, he was saying that sort of 1906, 1907, it was really difficult to make money out of the markets at this time. And so, this was after the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, and and you had the Jupiter square in 1906. So in this case, the Jupiter square in the 1906 Jupiter-Saturn square may have been problematic for the markets. But here you can see, here's a chart of that square. I've set this for London. I probably should have set it for New York. But Jupiter in Gemini, square Saturn in Pisces. That Jupiter is a bit problematic there because it's conjunct Mars. So I think you can see maybe why that Jupiter square Saturn didn't necessarily work too well for the markets. But by and large, that applying square tends to be quite fortunate, and that brings us on to the current cycle that we're in, which started in 2020. So here's a chart. I've set this for December the 21st, 2020. So this is the beginning. So this conjunction, took place 2020. So the year, it was the COVID year. I mean, sort of the COVID epidemic sort of officially started at sort of the beginning of 2020. But here you see the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction at 0 degrees 29 Aquarius, and we can say that this represents what we're in. Now, forget the fact for the moment this is set for London, but Jupiter-Saturn. What would Jupiter-Saturn in Aquarius? What might we think about that with Aquarius? Well, Aquarius, of course, we think about computers and we think about AI, And this could be the genesis of AI. That's okay. We know that AI has been around for a long time, but the issues of control of the real impact of technology and computers. If you played with ChatGPT, I mean, I'm quite naive about this, but it strikes me that ChatGPT is absolutely terrifying. You can actually have a conversation, or at least it feels like you can have a conversation with ChatGPT, and you have conversations with people in the street, and when you have conversation with people in the street, I mean, a lot of people they're just running scripts anyway. I mean, people have this human arrogance that we are somehow different, that we're not animals, but we are animals, and we do run scripts, and a lot of it is very automatic processing when we talk to people. You can actually have quite a long conversation, and we're just going through the motions. And ChatGPT, you could say, is more effective at having a conversation than with a lot of other, real people. And it's got better over the last year. It's scary. ChatGPT has a sense of humor. And the really scary thing about ChatGPT is if you ask it to write a sonnet. I mean, I find that scary. You think about how difficult it is to write a sonnet, and this thing can just write a sonnet, a really good sonnet, in just a split second. And yeah, I do find that worrying. So that may be one aspect of this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. That it is something new, and it is about technology. And as I've said on several occasions, I do regard this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction as being about Russia and about the East. And from a Ptolemaic perspective, there is an association between Aquarius and Russia, and indeed Ukraine and the East. You could argue even Poland. And of course, now people are saying that Poland is starting to really, as an example of a supposedly successful East European country, it could outstrip. People are saying, when is it going to outstrip the UK? It's already, in terms of standard of living, is starting to compete with West European countries, or so I've been told. I haven't been to Poland for a very long time. I haven't, but that may be a way in which one could be looking at Jupiter-Saturn. It's in Aquarius. It is about the East, and I wrote an article on my blog in 2020 about the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Russia, and I really did believe that this was going to be Russia's 20 years, or perhaps even more, but we're going to see a resurgence of Russia. So that was one view I got of this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. And so when we come to the square, we're starting to see how this conjunction is developing. And so this brings us to the square here. And so we come to this square. And I think that this square that we've got over the weekend really is important, because it's cardinal, because we've got Saturn has moved into Aries, and Jupiter has moved into Cancer. Now, going back to what I was saying, with the markets, there is a lot of uncertainty about the markets, and there has been for some time. People are talking about the dollar in danger. People have been talking about bond markets. Governments have so much debt that those buying bonds want sort of increasingly high interest rates in order to justify the risks. And the risk is there's not just a risk of default, there's also a risk of inflation. And so you will find a lot of people saying that everything is going to collapse. And from the perspective of this Jupiter square Saturn, you might say that this is actually some kind of final crisis. And in terms of the actual markets, By the way, I'm not making any financial forecasts here. This is an astrology channel. It's for entertainment purposes only. But you could argue with this Jupiter-Saturn square that it is actually very positive for the markets. Especially as Jupiter is now in a strong position. Jupiter's in Cancer. It's exalted in Cancer. Jupiter, the planet of growth, of expansion, things going up in price. Okay, inflation. That's one way of looking at Jupiter. But you might also say in terms of the price of various assets, whether it's stocks or Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies. That could suggest that they may go up in price. But I'm not saying they are going to go up in price, by the way, because, as I said, I must make it clear I'm not giving any financial advice here. And you contrast that with Saturn, the planet of restriction, of having to make sure that everything is in order, not getting into debt. It's in Aries. So you could simply say Jupiter is stronger than Saturn, and that this is going to be quite positive for the markets. And as I said, some time ago, when I was giving an introduction to this Jupiter-Saturn aspect, historically, the Jupiter-Saturn applying square tends to be fortunate for the markets. You think about the mid-20s or the mid-1980s. There's been a problem, there have been worries, but now things are starting to move ahead, and so that's certainly one way in which one can look at this Jupiter-Saturn square. And another way of looking at this Jupiter-Saturn square says something about technology. The Jupiter-Saturn conjunction was at 0 degrees Aquarius. Now we've got the square. We've got Pluto in Aquarius as well, and it is now that we're starting to see the real impact of technology. People have been talking about the internet and computers for decades, but now this is real. And it may not be the fact that this Jupiter-Saturn square happens to be on June the 15th, 2025. That may not be the issue. It's just a broad milestone. And this is the moment where people realize, for example, that AI is going to make a lot of people redundant. Even jobs which were supposedly, you needed a lot of education for, you needed human skill, for example, lawyers, and other sort of white collar jobs. People whatever, spend $500,000 going to law school, and except for the very best, those lawyers may soon enough find there's no work for them. And certainly all the administrative stuff, the routine stuff, can be done. You've got programs which can go through case law and can work it out. And if you look at ChatGPT, if you played with ChatGPT, you can really see what it can do. And there may be other professions that start to get attacked. Maybe the medical profession. You think, there's doctors. If you're a doctor or a nurse, you're never gonna be out of a job. Particularly in the US, and you get high salaries. But what's AI going to do next? And so this might be this sort of realization now with Jupiter square Saturn. Now, what I'm saying is quite obvious. We know this already, and you didn't need astrology to say this. But I think the astrological symbolism does fit. And what else started with a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction? Well, this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction did actually represent the slow start of the war in Ukraine. And so the Jupiter square Saturn is a realization, perhaps, that this war in Ukraine is starting to move in a particular direction. Now, when you had the Jupiter-Saturn square in 1941, it happened just before Pearl Harbor, 1941. Europe was already at war, America was not at war. The actual square didn't happen until the end of 1945, so the war was already over, but then you saw what the impact of that war was, for example, in terms of a division of Europe. And, in this case, the Jupiter-Saturn square is happening and the war in Ukraine is still going on, but it could be like a realization of the way this war is going, and I would have said this is perhaps a moment where people in the West really start to realize that Russia's winning, and they should have realized for a long time, but Russia is winning, and really there's not much that can be done about it. And so, those are some thoughts. I'm going to go back to look at some particular countries, but going back to where it all comes together, where we start to see the full results, or where does this stand in terms of the Jupiter-Saturn cycle? So the Jupiter-Saturn opposition is going to be is not going to be until 2029. So I make it December the 22nd, 2029, that we have the Jupiter-Saturn opposition. So this Jupiter square, there are some positive aspects to it, and we see maybe the positive sides of AI. People are talking about the positive sides, and the positive sides of growth. And I do think there is a real chance. Again, must emphasize, I'm not making any forecasts here. This is for entertainment purposes only, but I'm just not convinced that the stock market is just going to completely collapse or anything like that. And I think it might be the opposite if previous patterns, if previous phases of the Jupiter-Saturn cycle are anything to go by. In particular, the mid 2000s, the mid 1980s, the mid 1920s, if that is anything to go by. Though we shouldn't forget the first decade of the 20th century and the 1907 panic, although you could relate the 1907 panic to Black Monday and the 1987 stock market crash. Here's a Jupiter-Saturn opposition, which takes place, December the 22nd, 2029, and this is probably likely when it's all going around this time. It's all going to start to fall apart. And this Jupiter-Saturn, we see Saturn in Taurus, and that is reality hitting. And Jupiter opposition Saturn it's going to be after the 2028 election, obviously. So I'm thinking that Vance, I think it's likely to be Vance at the moment, is going to win in 2028, but soon after he wins, he's going to run into trouble. In the same way that you had the 1928 election, when Hoover won the 2028 election, things still looked good. The Jupiter-Saturn opposition hadn't hit home, but then a year after he was elected was the Wall Street crash, and then it became inevitable that the Democrats would win in 1932. That's right, the 1932 election. So That's how I'm seeing it, and I'm just thinking that there just may be just a feeling now that it's all okay now, that somehow, Trump, he'll just manage to get through, and the economy will be okay, at least in America. Although we do have to look at some sort of national charts to consider what this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction is going to do. So let's look at the United States chart. So here is the horoscope of the United States, and this chart is set for 5:10 p.m. and this is a chart for the United States which is used most widely. Now you might say that 5:10 p.m. How do you know that anything was signed at 5:10 p.m.? Well, this still is a chart that astrologers have widely used, and it does seem to work quite well. And this Jupiter-Saturn, this chart has an IC of 103 Aries. And, that means that Saturn is now on the United States' IC. And Jupiter is square the IC. So you have a conflicting message here. I mean, Saturn on the IC suggests that at a very fundamental level, something is wrong here with the US, with Saturn moving into the IC, crossing the IC. Now, I looked at it before and I was saying, well, one of the problems with the Trump administration is that they are going to contribute to the destruction of the environment. I mean, the Democrats aren't much better. But with Saturn on the IC, we're just going to see, how much damage can be done to the land on which is America. That's one way of looking at it. But it may be more fundamental. It may be, about the fabric of the United States' society on the IC. I mean, there may be something else that I'm not thinking about. And so, that does gravitate towards this Jupiter-Saturn square not necessarily being such a good thing. But on the other hand, Jupiter is moving into Cancer. Jupiter is about to make a conjunction of the United States with Venus. It's Jupiter, all its Cancer planets. So that might actually be quite fortunate, though we also have to remember that Uranus is moving into Gemini quite soon. And of course, when Uranus moves into Gemini, that means, if history is anything to go by, is that America needs to start preparing for war. But I'll perhaps talk about that in a later stage. And another place that might be impacted by this Jupiter-Saturn square is Palestine. So here's a chart for Palestine. I've taken the declaration which took place in sort of Algiers. That its independence was declared November the 15th, 1988. I made it at 12:40 a.m. That's the time I found. It was set for Algiers, not for Palestine. And so it's not a great chart. And what this chart has is it's got Mars square Saturn. So it's got Mars in Aries, 1 degree 51 Aries, and it's got Saturn at 0 degrees 16 Capricorn. And so Saturn is on Palestine's Mars, and Jupiter is opposition Palestine's Saturn, and also you've had a lot of stuff. Saturn and Neptune have recently been making squares to Palestine's Uranus. That will happen again, later in the year. So that the Mars-Saturn square, indeed, which Uranus is linked up in that, with that as well, it's really triggered by the Jupiter-Saturn square. So is this fortunate? I don't think it is. I don't think that the Palestinians are going to be beneficiaries of the Jupiter-Saturn square. I don't think it's going to work out for them at all. And I think that just looking at one chart, I think the prospects for anything good happening in Palestine, are not good. And on a more short-term basis, remember, we have got Mars is moving into very late Leo. So if this 12:40 a.m. time means anything, and it may not, because it's I don't know where that time came from, but if that declaration really was made at 12:40 a.m., what that means is that Mars is crossing Palestine's ascendant, and Uranus is making a square to that ascendant. So again, that doesn't look particularly good for Palestine. And then there is the UK. I do think that this Jupiter-Saturn cycle is hitting the UK really badly. I mean, already. And going back to the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction on December 21st, 2020, I've set this for London. And set for London, you have Jupiter-Saturn conjunction exactly on the descendant. And so that seems to me to be a powerful signal of decline. The sun well, it used to be the case that the sun would never set on the British Empire, but now the sun is setting on on the British Empire for sure, or at least Jupiter-Saturn is, with Jupiter-Saturn right on the descendant. And there is just an indication of decline that this Jupiter, if you think about 2020, of course, Britain had already been ravaged by COVID and excessive expenditure, plus Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, does represent Britain's enemies, or people Britain has tried to make its enemies, and of course, within just over a year of this conjunction, Britain, started getting involved in the war with Ukraine, which has been absolutely devastating for Britain in terms of, for example, energy prices. Britain did not show the right kind of leadership. Boris Johnson, who was Prime Minister at the time of this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, got Britain into this war, and there was a chance for, after the Istanbul peace talks in 2022, for this war to end, and the West told Ukraine they had to carry on, and as a result, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians died, and a lot of Russians died as well, and so Britain was very much involved with it, and there's maybe a feeling that Britain is now starting to reap what it has sowed, and reap the incredible damage that it's caused, and that might be one aspect of it, but it might be about just a country running its course. And so I think that Jupiter-Saturn conjunction on the descendant is very much a powerful signature of that. And if you remember that point, 0 degrees 29 Aquarius, and you remember that point, and then we look at the Jupiter-Saturn square set for London, you can see that the IC is at 0 degrees 46. So the IC of that moment when the Jupiter-Saturn square comes exact has the degree where Jupiter and Saturn were at the conjunction, sort of really sort of baked into the chart. And one particular aspect of Britain, the government, is also going to be, I think, impacted by the Jupiter-Saturn square. And so here is the chart for the moment that Keir Starmer became Prime Minister. After he went to the palace, I think it's at 12:15 p.m. And if that timing is correct, that means that the descendant is 148 Aries, and the midheaven is at 2 degrees 20 Cancer. So Jupiter is on the midheaven, and Saturn is on the IC. And I think that the Jupiter-Saturn square, well, you could say, oh yeah, but Jupiter's on the midheaven. Well, that's good, isn't it? Well, the midheaven represents leadership, and Saturn is square the midheaven, and I think that matters. And Jupiter crossing a midheaven can be about the beginning of a job, and it can be about the ending of a job. And so I think that this Jupiter-Saturn square is going to be, a real negative for certainly the British government. I think it's just, as I've said recently, I don't think Starmer is going to find it easy to continue from now on. I think that I think it's going to be quite likely that his time as Prime Minister is from now on it's going to be short. I don't see how much longer he can stay in that position, especially with that Jupiter-Saturn square hitting the angles of his regime. So those are a few thoughts about the Jupiter-Saturn square. It is complicated and it's contradictory. We can see evidence of this Jupiter-Saturn square that things look perhaps good for the markets, well, at least on past performance. But on the other hand, there are things that really look quite grim. For example, Saturn on the United States is IC. So we'll have to monitor this Jupiter-Saturn square. But it's not like when I've shown you this chart for the Jupiter-Saturn square, I'm just showing you a chart and I'm saying, okay, well, that's happening over the weekend and we'll just move on and we'll never look at that chart again. That chart is going to be in force for a long time and we need to keep referring back to it. So thank you very much for watching this video. If you did enjoy this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, I'd be super grateful if you were to subscribe. If you want to buy me a coffee, there's a link in the description, and I will talk to you again tomorrow.